Daddy, they're hurting you because of your skin, aren't they? Those 8 words, spoken by an 8-year-old girl watching her father being dragged off an airplane, would trigger the most expensive mistake in aviation history. They would cost an airline $52 billion, destroy careers, and ultimately transform an entire industry. This is the story of how a child's innocent question taught a billionaire that true power isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring no other child ever has to ask that same heartbreaking question. JFK Airport felt like a pressure cooker on this particular Friday evening in November. The rain hammered against the terminal windows with the persistence of a debt collector, creating a gray curtain that delayed every flight and frayed every nerve. Inside Terminal 4, the usual chaos of international travel had been amplified by weather-induced frustration, turning normally patient travelers into ticking time bombs of irritation and anxiety. Damian Torres sat in the corner of the first-class lounge, deliberately positioned as far away from the buffet and bar as possible, seeking invisibility rather than luxury. To any casual observer, he looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong area entirely. His charcoal gray oversized hoodie had seen better days, the kind of comfortable wear that only comes from countless late nights spent building an empire. His black joggers bore the subtle creases of someone who had been traveling for days, and his beaten-up Nike sneakers told the story of a man who valued comfort over image when exhaustion set in. The massive noise-canceling headphones covering his ears weren't playing music. They were his shield against the world, a barrier he desperately needed after 72 hours of the most intense negotiations of his career. Beneath the casual exterior that suggested he might be lost or out of place, Damian Torres was worth conservatively $9 billion. He was the CEO and founder of Titan Capital, a private equity firm so powerful and discreet that they preferred to own the news rather than make it. The deal he had just closed in Silicon Valley would reshape the semiconductor industry for the next decade, securing majority stakes in manufacturers that supplied chips to Tesla, Apple, and every major tech company that mattered. But right now, sitting in this anonymous corner of the lounge, staring out at the rain-soaked tarmac through tired eyes, Damian didn't feel like a billionaire who had just pulled off one of the most significant acquisitions of the year. He felt like a father who missed his daughter and desperately needed 6 hours of uninterrupted sleep on his way to London for an emergency board meeting that would determine the future of 3,000 jobs. His phone buzzed with a text from Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan Chase. "Deal is funded. Congratulations, Damian. The banking sector won't be the same." He smiled briefly, pocketing the device without responding. There would be time for celebration later, after he handled the crisis waiting for him in London, and more importantly, after he picked up his daughter. Sophia Torres, 8 years old and wise beyond her years, was flying separately to visit her grandmother in London, something Damian had arranged to teach her humility and independence. Despite being able to afford private jets for every trip he wanted, Sophia to understand that privilege was something to be earned and appreciated, not simply expected. Her economy class ticket was a deliberate choice, a lesson in staying grounded despite their family's extraordinary wealth. He had planned to quietly move her to first class after takeoff, a surprise that would make her smile in that brilliant way that reminded him so much of her mother, Elena, who had passed away 3 years earlier in a car accident. Elena had been the moral compass of their family, a civil rights attorney who believed that wealth came with the responsibility to lift others up, not to tower above them. The boarding announcement for Flight 492 to Heathrow crackled through the lounge speakers, pulling Damian from his thoughts. He gathered his battered leather duffel bag, the same one he had carried through law school and every major business triumph since. As he made his way to the gate, he caught sight of Sophia in the general boarding area, her small backpack neatly organized and her expression serious as she reviewed the safety card she had insisted on reading despite having flown dozens of times before. Their eyes met across the terminal, and she gave him a small wave, their agreed-upon signal that she was ready and confident. At 8 years old, Sophia possessed an emotional intelligence that constantly amazed her father, able to read situations and people with an accuracy that some adults never developed. She understood that this trip was about more than visiting her grandmother. It was about learning to navigate the world on her own terms with grace and humility. Damien deliberately waited until the final boarding call, hoping to avoid the crowds and slip onto the plane unnoticed, a strategy that usually worked well for his preference to remain anonymous during travel. The jet bridge felt oppressive under the fluorescent lighting, and he could hear the muffled sounds of passengers settling into their seats as he approached the aircraft door. The cabin of Flight 492 was pristine with the soft blue LED lighting that Skyline Air used as their signature calming atmosphere, though tonight the tension among the crew was palpable despite their professional smiles. Rebecca Hayes had been working for Skyline Air for 8 years, long enough to develop what she considered a refined sense of who belonged in first class and who was trying to game the upgrade process. She prided herself on maintaining the exclusive atmosphere that premium passengers paid for, and she had learned to spot potential troublemakers from across the cabin. When she saw a black man in a hoodie and sneakers approaching seat 1A, every instinct she had developed over nearly a decade of service told her something was wrong. Her smile was professionally perfect, but didn't reach her eyes as she positioned herself strategically in the aisle. Her posture stiff, with the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with passengers who in her mind tried to sit where they didn't belong. She watched as Damien located his seat, stowed his bag in the overhead compartment with the efficient movements of someone who traveled frequently, and settled into the window seat that he had specifically chosen for its privacy and the ability to sleep undisturbed during the 8-hour flight. "Excuse me, sir," Rebecca said, her voice loud enough that several other first-class passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, creating the kind of attention that Damien had specifically boarded late to avoid. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass and identification. We've had some irregularities with our manifest tonight, and I need to verify that all passengers are in their correct seats." Damien looked up from adjusting his seat, his expression patient despite the obvious fatigue that lined his face. "I showed everything at the gate," he replied quietly, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spent days in intense negotiations. "Is there a specific problem with my seat assignment?" The question was reasonable, but Rebecca had already decided that this passenger didn't fit her mental image of someone who could afford a $14,000 first-class ticket. In her experience, the black passengers who could afford premium seating were usually celebrities, athletes, or entertainment industry executives who dressed the part and carried themselves with obvious wealth. This man looked like he had wandered away from the economy boarding area and was hoping no one would notice. The problem, Rebecca said, emphasizing the word in a way that made it clear she considered his presence itself to be the issue, is that first class is reserved for our most valued customers, and I need to ensure that everyone in this cabin is supposed to be here. Could you please show me your boarding pass and a photo ID that matches the name on the ticket? From her position, 3 rows back in economy class, Sophia Torres could see the interaction unfolding, and something in her chest began to tighten with the familiar feeling she got when adults started treating her father differently because of how he looked. She had witnessed these moments before in restaurant hostess areas, where they assumed he couldn't afford the prices, in luxury stores where security guards followed him despite his obvious wealth, in hotel lobbies where staff questioned whether he was actually a guest. Each time her father handled the situation with dignified patience, but Sophia was beginning to understand that her father's calm responses came at a cost that other parents never had to pay. Near the gate area, Tyler Ashford was growing increasingly agitated about being denied an upgrade despite his repeated insistence that his father's Senate connections should guarantee him premium treatment. Tyler was a 23-year-old social media influencer whose entire brand was built around luxury lifestyle content that his family's political connections helped him access. He had over 2 million followers who expected him to fly first-class, stay in penthouse suites, and attend exclusive events, and being stuck in economy would ruin the content he had planned for his London trip. When he overheard Rebecca questioning the passenger in seat 1A, Tyler saw an opportunity to solve his own problem while creating content that his audience would find entertaining. He approached the gate agent with his phone already recording planning to document his successful upgrade, while simultaneously capturing what he assumed would be the removal of someone who clearly didn't belong in premium seating. Rebecca watched Tyler's approach and immediately recognized the kind of passenger she preferred to accommodate young, well-dressed, obviously wealthy, and carrying himself with the entitled confidence that she associated with first-class service. When Tyler quietly mentioned his father's position in the Senate and suggested that perhaps the airline could find a way to resolve both the seating irregularity and his upgrade request, simultaneously, Rebecca saw a perfect solution to what she perceived as two separate problems. Captain Thomas Bradley had been flying for Skyline Air for 15 years, long enough to develop an unshakable belief in his own authority and a deep irritation with anything that threatened to delay his carefully managed flight schedules. When Rebecca approached the cockpit to explain the situation in first class, she described it in terms that immediately triggered his protective instincts about maintaining order and ensuring the comfort of VIP passengers. "We have a passenger in 1A who doesn't appear to belong there." Rebecca explained, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed she was protecting the airline's reputation. "His documentation might be questionable, and we have Senator Ashford's son requesting accommodation for an important diplomatic trip. I think we need to resolve this before takeoff to avoid any issues during the flight." Captain Bradley's decision was immediate and unquestioned. In his experience, passengers who caused problems during boarding usually became bigger problems at 35,000 feet, and he had learned that early intervention prevented escalation. He had no interest in investigating the details or verifying Rebecca's assessment. He trusted his crew's judgment and prioritized the smooth operation of his flight above all other considerations. The conversation between Captain Bradley and Damien started with the kind of authoritative tone that the captain had perfected over decades of managing difficult passengers, though he had never encountered a situation quite like this one before. Bradley approached seat 1A with the confidence of someone who expected immediate compliance with his instructions, his silver hair and broad shoulders giving him the presence of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Sir, I'm Captain Bradley," he announced, his voice carrying across the first-class cabin in a way that made every other passenger look up from their devices and magazines. "We need you to gather your belongings and move to an available seat in the main cabin. We have a VIP passenger who requires accommodation in first class, and per airline protocol, we need to make this adjustment before departure." Damien looked up from his seat, his expression remaining calm despite the absurdity of the request and the growing attention from other passengers who were beginning to sense that something unusual was happening. "Captain, I purchased this seat at full price, $14,000 paid, with my American Express Centurion card. I have my boarding pass, my ID, and my receipt. I'm not moving unless you can show me a legitimate reason why I should give up a seat I legally purchased." The response was reasonable, polite, and completely factual, but Captain Bradley interpreted Damien's refusal to immediately comply as a direct challenge to his authority. In his worldview, passengers who questioned crew decisions were inherently problematic, and passengers who remained seated while being addressed by the captain were showing dangerous disrespect that could escalate into more serious issues. "Sir, I am the captain of this aircraft, which means my word is final when it comes to passenger seating and safety decisions," Bradley replied, his voice rising slightly as other passengers began pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a confrontational situation. "We have operational requirements that override individual preferences, and I'm instructing you to move to the seat we're providing in the main cabin. This is not a negotiation." From her seat in economy, Sophia could see her father's interaction with the uniformed man, and every instinct she had developed during 8 years of watching adults treat her family differently was telling her that something was going very wrong. She had learned to read the warning signs, the way people's voices changed when they looked at her father, The way their posture became more aggressive, the way they seemed to assume he was lying, even when he told the truth. Sophia unbuckled her seatbelt and started to stand up, wanting to reach her father, or at least make it clear that he wasn't alone. But the flight attendant in the economy cabin immediately noticed and approached her with a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetie, you need to stay in your seat with your seatbelt fastened," the attendant said kindly, not realizing that she was separating a child from her father during what was becoming an increasingly volatile situation. "We'll be taking off soon, and it's not safe to be standing in the aisle." "That's my daddy," Sophia said quietly, pointing toward the first-class cabin, her voice carrying a mixture of worry and pride that made the flight attendant pause and look more carefully at what was happening in the premium section. "Is he in trouble? He didn't do anything wrong." The flight attendant followed Sophia's gaze and could see the situation escalating in first class, but airline protocol was clear about keeping passengers in their assigned seats during boarding, and she didn't have the authority or the context to understand that she was preventing a child from reaching her father during what was about to become a traumatic experience. Captain Bradley's patience had reached its limit, and he keyed his radio to call for airport security, a decision that would transform what could have been a simple misunderstanding into a violent confrontation that would be recorded by dozens of passengers and viewed by millions of people around the world. "Security to Gate 22. We have a non-compliant passenger refusing crew instructions, requesting immediate assistance with passenger removal." When Damien heard the security call, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not to make a call or record the situation, but simply to check the time and consider his options. The movement was innocent and deliberate, but Rebecca Hayes immediately jumped backward and pointed at him with obvious alarm. "He's reaching for something," she shouted, her voice carrying a note of panic that sent a ripple of fear through the cabin and would later be cited as the reason why the security response was so aggressive. "Captain, he might have a weapon." The accusation was completely false. Damien was simply holding his iPhone, which was clearly visible in his hand, but the damage was done. Several passengers gasped and moved away from the aisle. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from uncomfortable tension to genuine fear. And the security team that was already responding to the call received updated information that characterized Damien as potentially dangerous rather than simply non-compliant. The 3 airport security officers who boarded the plane were private contractors, not trained police officers, and they had been told they were dealing with a hostile passenger who might be armed and was refusing to follow crew instructions. They entered the aircraft with the aggressive posture of people who expected to encounter resistance, and they approached Seat 1A with the intention of resolving the situation quickly and decisively, regardless of the passenger's cooperation. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately." The lead officer said, his hand moving toward Damien's shoulder before any conversation or de-escalation could take place. "Stand up and gather your belongings. You're being removed from this aircraft." Damien raised both hands, his phone clearly visible, and spoke in the calm, controlled voice that had served him well in countless high-stakes negotiations. "I am not resisting," he said clearly, making sure his words would be audible to the passengers who were recording the interaction. "I have done nothing wrong. I am a paying passenger with a valid ticket. If you're going to remove me, you'll have to carry me because I will not voluntarily give up a seat I legally purchased." The lead security officer interpreted Damien's refusal to stand as resistance, and what happened next would be replayed millions of times on social media and news broadcasts around the world. Instead of attempting further dialogue or calling for a supervisor, the officer grabbed Damien's hoodie and yanked him upward with enough force that the fabric tore audibly in the quiet cabin. The sound of the tearing fabric was followed by Sophia's voice, cutting through the tension with the clarity and heartbreak that only a child's cry can carry. "Daddy, they're hurting you because of your skin, aren't they?" Her question stopped the entire cabin cold. The passengers who had been recording lowered their phones for a moment, struck by the innocent accuracy of her observation. The security officers paused, realizing for the first time that they were removing a father in front of his young daughter. Rebecca Hayes felt something twist in her stomach as she understood that she had separated a family and traumatized a child, but the momentum of violence, once started, proved impossible to stop. The security officers resumed their removal of Damien, lifting him from his seat with unnecessary roughness, and during the struggle, the lead officer drove his knee into Damien's ribs with a sickening crack that echoed through the cabin. Damien grunted in pain but maintained his composure, going completely limp to avoid giving them any justification for further violence. They dragged him down the aisle past Sophia's seat, and she reached out toward him as they passed her small hand, briefly touching his arm, before the economy flight attendant pulled her back. One of his shoes fell off during the struggle, a detail that would later become a symbol of the dehumanizing treatment he received, and his head struck the armrest of seat 3C hard enough to leave a visible mark. As the cabin door slammed shut behind the security team and Captain Bradley prepared for departure, Tyler Ashford settled into seat 1A with his champagne and began posting celebratory content to his social media accounts, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just participated in an incident that would destroy his career and cost an airline $52 billion. Sophia sat in her economy seat, tears streaming down her face, clutching her phone and the video she had managed to record of her father being dragged away. She didn't understand the business implications or the legal complexities, but she understood injustice with the crystal-clear vision that children possess before the world teaches them to rationalize and compromise. Flight 492 took off on schedule, climbing into the dark Atlantic sky, carrying a cabin full of witnesses, a traumatized child, and a crew that had no idea they had just made the most expensive mistake in aviation history. The holding cell at JFK Terminal 4 was designed for one purpose: to break the spirit of anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves locked inside its cinder block walls, painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed to drain hope from the air itself. The fluorescent lights hummed with the kind of persistent buzz that burrowed into your skull, and the air carried the metallic tang of old fear mixed with industrial cleaning supplies that never quite masked the human desperation that had soaked into every surface over the years. Damien sat on the metal bench, bolted to the floor, his hands still zip-tied behind his back with plastic restraints that had been tightened to the point where his fingers were beginning to go numb. Every breath sent a sharp spike of pain radiating from his left ribs, where the security officer's knee had made contact, and he could taste blood in his mouth from where his head had struck the armrest during the dragging. The torn hoodie hung loose around his shoulders, a tangible reminder of the violence that had been inflicted on him in front of his daughter and dozens of witnesses. Sergeant Mike Kowalski sat behind a scratched metal desk, pecking slowly at a keyboard with the deliberate movements of someone who had never quite mastered typing, but had been doing this job long enough to know that paperwork was the most important part of any arrest. Kowalski was a man who had peaked during his high school football years and had spent the subsequent decades trying to recapture that feeling of dominance and respect through his work in airport security. Name Kowalski grunted without looking up from his screen, his voice carrying the bored authority of someone who processed dozens of difficult passengers every month and saw them all as variations on the same theme of people who couldn't handle their alcohol or their attitude at 35,000 feet above sea level. Damien closed his eyes and regulated his breathing using a technique he had learned during hostile takeover negotiations, where remaining calm under pressure could mean the difference between success and failure worth billions of dollars. Pain was just data, he reminded himself. Humiliation was just leverage waiting to be converted into power. The key was patience and precision. "I want my phone call," Damien said quietly, his voice hoarse from the struggle and the pain in his ribs, but still carrying the controlled authority of someone who was accustomed to being heard and obeyed in the most important rooms in the world. Kowalski laughed, a wet sound that revealed years of cigarettes and cheap coffee. "You watch too many movies, pal," he said, swiveling his chair around to face the cell for the first time since Damien had been thrown inside. This isn't some cop show. This is airport detention. We process you, we ban you from flying, and then we hand you over to the NYPD when they get here. They're stuck in traffic, so you're mine for at least another hour." The sergeant stood up and walked to the cell door, gripping the bars in a way that was meant to be intimidating but only revealed his own insecurity about dealing with someone who refused to be broken by the degrading treatment. "Last chance," Kowalski said. "Give me a name for the paperwork or I book you as John Doe and you spend the weekend in Rikers until some judge figures out who you are on Monday morning." Damien opened his eyes, and the look he gave Kowalski was the same one he had used to stare down SEC, investigators, hostile board members, and senators who thought they could intimidate him during regulatory hearings. It was the gaze of a man who had built an empire by never blinking first, never backing down, and never forgetting who had tried to break him when he was at his most vulnerable. "My name," Damien said, articulating each syllable with icy precision that made Kowalski take an unconscious step backward, "is Damien Elias Torres. I am the CEO and founder of Titan Capital, worth approximately $9 billion. If you do not cut these zip ties off my wrists and hand me my phone in the next 60 seconds, you will not just lose your job. You will be named personally in a federal lawsuit that will take your house, your pension, and any hope you ever had of retiring with dignity." Kowalski blinked suddenly, noticing details he had missed before: the expensive watch barely visible under Damien's torn sleeve, the quality of the leather bag that had been confiscated, the way this man carried himself even while zip-tied and bloodied. Something in his stomach began to twist with the first seeds of doubt and fear. Torres, Kowalski muttered, walking back to his computer with movements that were no longer quite as confident as they had been moments before. He opened a browser window and typed the name into Google, expecting to find nothing, or maybe a small business owner who was inflating his importance. The first result that appeared was Damien's photo on the cover of Forbes magazine with the headline, "The Quiet Killer: How Damien Torres Became Wall Street's Most Feared Operator." The sidebar listed his net worth at $9.2 billion and described Titan Capital as one of the most powerful private equity firms in the world. Kowalski's mouth went dry as he clicked through to additional articles about billion-dollar acquisitions, political influence, and a business empire that operated largely behind the scenes but wielded enormous power over the global economy. The sergeant's hands were shaking as he grabbed his keys and approached the cell door, fumbling with the lock while trying to process the magnitude of his mistake. He had just brutalized and humiliated one of the most powerful men in America, someone who had the resources to end his career and destroy his life with a single phone call. Sir Kowalski stammered as he cut the zip ties, watching Damien rub his wrists where the plastic had cut into the skin. "I didn't know. The airline said you were just a troublemaker, a drunk passenger who was causing problems." Damien accepted his phone from Kowalski's trembling hands without a word of thanks or acknowledgement. He scrolled through his contacts, passing names that would have made Kowalski's knees buckle. Tim Cook, Oprah Winfrey, 3 Supreme Court justices, and half the Fortune 500 CEOs in America. He stopped at Victor Chang, General Counsel, and pressed call. Victor answered before the first ring completed. "Damien, you're supposed to be in the air. We got an alert that your phone was stationary at JFK. What's happening?" Victor. Damien said, his voice carrying a calm that was far more terrifying than any anger could have been. "I need you to listen very carefully. I am currently in a holding cell at JFK Terminal 4. I have been physically assaulted by airport security. I have been denied passage on a flight I paid for. My daughter witnessed me being dragged off the airplane. I have sustained physical injuries, and the entire incident was recorded by multiple passengers." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, followed by the rapid clicking of computer keys. "Jesus Christ, Damien. I'm sending a team immediately. I'll have the police commissioner on the line in 60 seconds. "Who did this skyline hair?" Damien replied, his voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow filling the small cell with menace. Flight 492, Captain Thomas Bradley, Flight Attendant Rebecca Hayes, 3 security contractors whose names I'll get from the report. While Damien sat into the holding cell methodically planning the destruction of Skyline Air, 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Flight 492 had become an unknowing time capsule of ignorance flying through the night sky. The passengers in first class were settling into their seats for the long journey to London, completely unaware that the man they had watched being dragged from seat 1A was about to trigger the most spectacular corporate collapse in aviation history. In economy class, Sofia Torres sat curled against the window, her small hands clutching her phone with the video she had recorded of her father's removal. She had stopped crying, but her eyes remained fixed on the dark ocean below her 8-year-old mind, trying to process what she had witnessed and what it meant for her family. The passenger next to her, a college student named Maya Chen, had offered her tissues and quiet comfort, but Sophia had retreated into the kind of protective silence that children develop when the adult world reveals its ugliness too suddenly and too completely. Maya had also recorded portions of the incident, and during the first hour of the flight, she uploaded Sophia's video along with her own footage to TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, with captions that were simple but devastating. Skyline. Air just violently removed a father from his seat while his little girl watched. This is not okay. The airplane's Wi-Fi was slow, but the videos began uploading as the plane crossed into international airspace, carrying with them the seeds of a global scandal. Back on the ground, Victor Chang was orchestrating what would later be described by financial journalists as the most precisely executed corporate assassination in business history. From his office on the 45th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, Victor had access to trading systems, legal networks, and financial instruments that could move billions of dollars with the click of a mouse. He had been Damien's general counsel for 12 years, and he understood that his client's request wasn't just about revenge. It was about sending a message that would resonate throughout every boardroom in corporate America. Execute the full liquidation, Victor said into his headset to a trader in Singapore, where the international markets were just beginning their day. Dump every share of Skyline Air. We hold all convertible bonds, all derivative positions. I don't care about the loss. I want them off our books in the next 30 minutes. Skyline Air had closed Friday trading at $42 per share, giving the company a market capitalization of approximately $52 billion. But that valuation depended on investor confidence, predictable cash flows, and the assumption that the airline would continue operating as a stable business entity. Victor's sell order was massive enough to trigger every algorithmic trading system on Wall Street, and within minutes, stop-loss orders began executing automatically as computers detected the massive institutional dump and responded by selling even more shares. The stock price began falling in real time: $42, $38, $33, $28, and continuing to drop as after-hours trading volume exploded beyond anything the market had seen for an airline stock. Financial news algorithms detected the unusual activity and began pushing alerts to subscribers, but the human analysts who might have investigated the cause wouldn't return to their desks until Monday morning. Victor's second move was even more devastating. He opened a secure email client and began drafting a message to the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, attaching the police report from JFK medical records showing Damien's injuries and the loan agreement between Titan Capital and Skyline Air. He highlighted Clause 14B, the material adverse change clause that allowed Titan to demand immediate repayment of the entire $4.5 billion debt facility if Skyline Air engaged in conduct that materially damaged their reputation or ability to operate. The email was forwarded simultaneously to the financial editors of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and Bloomberg News. Along with a brief statement, Titan Capital is declaring Skyline Air in default of their debt covenants following the unprovoked assault of our CEO by airline personnel and security contractors. We demand immediate repayment of all outstanding obligations and will be pursuing additional legal remedies. The story went live online within 20 minutes, breaking Titan. Capital declares default on Skyline. Air debt. Following CEO assault. The headline was enough to trigger a second wave of selling as investors realized that the airline was facing not just a public relations crisis, but a potential liquidity crisis that could force them into bankruptcy within days. Jonathan Rivers, the CEO of Skyline Air, was at a charity dinner in Dallas when his phone began buzzing with such intensity that it nearly fell off the table. 52 missed calls, hundreds of text messages and email alerts that kept coming so fast he couldn't read them. When he finally answered his chief financial officer's call, the panic in David Kim's voice was immediately apparent. "Jonathan, you need to get to the office right now," David said, his words coming so fast they were almost unintelligible. "Our stock is in free fall. Someone is dumping massive positions in after-hours trading. We've lost $18 billion in market cap in the last hour, and it's accelerating." "Calm down, David," Rivers replied, excusing himself from the dinner and walking toward the exit with growing alarm. "Markets are closed. How bad can after-hours trading be?" "This isn't normal profit-taking, Jonathan. This is institutional warfare. Titan Capital just declared us in default on our debt facility. They're demanding immediate repayment of $4.5 billion, and they're claiming we assaulted their CEO. Jonathan, I think we just beat up Damian Torres." The phone nearly slipped from Rivers' hands as the full implications of what David was telling him began to sink in. Damian Torres wasn't just any passenger, he was one of the most powerful and feared financiers in the world, and more importantly, he was the man who held the key to Skyline Air's survival through the debt facility that had kept them operating during the pandemic. Flight 492 touched down at London Heathrow at 7 a.m. local time, the landing smooth and routine despite the human catastrophe that was unfolding in the digital world below. Captain Bradley felt the familiar satisfaction of another successful transatlantic flight, checking his instruments and preparing to taxi to the gate while making small talk with his co-pilot about their plans for the layover in London. "Excellent flight," Thomas, his co-pilot, remarked as they followed the ground controller's instructions toward Terminal 3. "We made up 15 minutes despite the weather delay in New York. The passengers should be pleased with the early arrival." Bradley smiled with the confidence of a man who had no idea that his career was about to end in the most public and humiliating way possible. Smooth sailing, he agreed, adjusting his captain's hat and checking his appearance in the reflection of the cockpit window. "I'll probably grab a pint at the pub before we head back. Want to join me?" In the first-class cabin, Rebecca Hayes was completing her post-flight procedures with the same professional efficiency she had maintained throughout her 8 years with Skyline Air. She had put the incident with the passenger in seat 1A out of her mind, entirely focusing instead on the shopping she planned to do on Oxford Street, and the satisfaction of having maintained the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers expected and deserved. Tyler Ashford was gathering his belongings with a self-satisfied smile, already planning the social media content he would create about his successful upgrade and his first-class experience. He had posted several photos and videos during the flight, including a celebratory selfie in seat 1A with the caption, "First class treats me right. Some people just don't know how to behave on airplanes." His followers had responded with the kind of engagement he thrived on, completely unaware of the storm that was building around the flight they thought was just another luxury travel story. The plane came to a complete stop at Gate 22, and Rebecca unlocked the cabin door with the same routine efficiency she had performed thousands of times before. She pushed it open with her professional smile in place, expecting to greet the usual ground crew and perhaps a gate agent checking on the passenger manifest. Instead, she was immediately blinded by a wall of camera flashes that erupted from the jet bridge like lightning strikes. The narrow corridor that connected the plane to the terminal was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters, photographers, and camera crews from the BBC, Sky News, CNN, the Daily Mail, and every major news organization in Europe. The jet bridge, which should have been empty except for ground personnel, had been transformed into a gauntlet of media attention that no crew member was prepared to face. Rebecca Hayes, a reporter from The Sun, shouted, shoving a microphone toward her face before she could even step off the plane. "Is it true you racially profiled billionaire Damien Torres? How does it feel to know your actions may have bankrupted your own airline?" Rebecca stumbled backward into the galley, her professional composure evaporating as she tried to shield her eyes from the flashing cameras and process what the reporters were saying. The name Damien Torres meant nothing to her, and she had no idea why the media would be interested in what she considered a routine passenger removal, but the aggressive questioning and the sheer number of journalists suggested something had gone catastrophically wrong. Behind her, Captain Bradley emerged from the cockpit to investigate the commotion, and immediately found himself facing the same wall of cameras and shouted questions. "Captain Bradley." "Captain Bradley," a BBC correspondent called out. "Are you aware that Skyline Air's stock has crashed 90% while you were in the air? How do you feel about piloting what may have been the airline's final flight?" The questions made no sense to Bradley, who had left New York with a functioning airline and expected to return to a functioning airline, but the presence of law enforcement officers at the back of the media scrum suggested that this was far more serious than a typical public relations issue. 4 officers from the London Metropolitan Police were standing quietly behind the reporters, their expressions professional but grim. One of the officers stepped forward, pushing through the press with practiced efficiency. "Captain Bradley, Rebecca Hayes," he said, in a voice that carried clearly over the noise of the cameras and questions. "I'm Inspector Collins with the Metropolitan Police. We've been asked to detain you for questioning regarding an alleged assault at JFK Airport, and for your own safety, I would strongly advise against attempting to walk through the terminal unescorted." Tyler Ashford tried to slip past the chaos with his hood pulled up, hoping to avoid the media attention that was clearly focused on the crew members, but his attempt at anonymity failed when one of the camera operators recognized him from his social media presence. "That's Tyler Ashford," the cameraman shouted, the influencer who took the seat. "Tyler, how does it feel to know your upgrade cost 40,000 people their jobs?" Tyler broke into a run down the jet bridge, pursued by a pack of photographers whose cameras captured his panicked flight in high definition. The images of him fleeing would become some of the most widely shared photos of the entire scandal, and his influencer career would be effectively over before he cleared British customs. Back in the cabin, Rebecca was sobbing openly, now her makeup running down her face as she tried to hide behind the galley wall. The professional authority she had wielded so confidently just hours before had completely evaporated, replaced by the terrified realization that her actions had somehow triggered consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. Inspector Collins looked at the 2 crew members with something approaching sympathy. They were clearly unprepared for the magnitude of what they were facing, and while he had his orders to detain them for questioning, he could see that they were already being punished by the public exposure in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. "Come with me," he said quietly, leading them away from the cameras toward a private exit that would allow them to avoid the worst of the media circus. "We'll sort this out at the station, away from all this madness." As they walked through the terminal under police escort, Rebecca caught sight of a news monitor displaying footage from JFK Airport security officers dragging a man in a torn hoodie down an airplane aisle, while a little girl reached out toward him. For the first time, she saw her actions from the perspective of the witnesses, and the full horror of what she had participated in began to sink in. The man in the hoodie was Damien Torres, one of the most powerful people in the world, and the little girl reaching out toward him was his daughter, watching her father being brutalized because Rebecca had decided he didn't look like he belonged in first class. 3 days after the incident, Sophia Torres sat in her grandmother's flat in Knightsbridge, a cozy space filled with family photographs and the kind of warmth that comes from decades of love and careful attention to the small details that make a house feel like home. Her grandmother, Elena Torres Sr., had been her father's mother-in-law and had remained close to the family after her daughter's death, serving as the kind of stable, nurturing presence that Sophia needed during the times when her father's business demands took him away from home. Sophia hadn't spoken much since arriving in London, spending most of her time curled up in the window seat of her grandmother's living room, staring out at the quiet street below while clutching her phone with the video that had now been viewed by over 50 million people around the world. The images of her father being dragged from the airplane played constantly on the news, but Sophia couldn't bring herself to watch the coverage because every replay meant seeing her daddy hurt again. Her grandmother had tried to engage her in their usual activities, baking cookies, reading together, working on the puzzle they had been completing during previous visits, but Sophia remained withdrawn, processing the trauma of watching her father being violently removed from the airplane while she sat helpless in economy class, unable to protect him or even reach him during his moment of greatest vulnerability. The phone rang throughout the day with calls from reporters, lawyers, and business associates who wanted to speak with her father, but Sophia ignored them all until she saw a familiar contact appear on the screen. Dad. She answered immediately, and the sound of his voice brought the first smile to her face since leaving JFK Airport 3 days earlier. "Hello, Sparrow," Damien said, using the pet name that had belonged to her alone since she was old enough to speak. "How are you feeling? Grandma says you've been very quiet since you arrived." Sophia's voice was small when she replied, but clear and thoughtful in the way that had always impressed the adults in her life with its emotional intelligence and surprising wisdom. "Daddy, I've been thinking about what happened on the airplane, and I keep watching the video I took, and I have some questions that I don't understand." Damien settled back in his hotel room chair, giving his daughter his complete attention, despite the dozens of urgent matters that required his focus. Since the incident, he had been consumed with coordinating the legal and financial response that would destroy Skyline Air, completely working with Victor and a team of attorneys to ensure that the airline would never recover from their attack on his family. "What questions do you have, sweetheart?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on events that were dominating international news coverage and reshaping the aviation industry's approach to passenger treatment. "Well," Sophia began, her voice taking on the serious tone she used when working through complex problems. "I understand that the people on the airplane were mean to you because of your skin color, and I understand that you have the power to make their company go away forever. But Daddy, if you make the whole airline disappear, what happens to all the people who work there who weren't mean to us?" The question hit Damien with unexpected force because in his focus on revenge and justice, he hadn't fully considered the broader implications of his actions on the innocent employees who had nothing to do with the discrimination he had experienced. Sophia's perspective was cutting through his anger and forcing him to consider consequences that his business mind had dismissed as acceptable collateral damage. "Those people will have to find new jobs, Sparrow," he replied honestly. "Sometimes when companies make big mistakes, there are consequences for everyone who works there, even the people who didn't do anything wrong." Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and Damien could hear her thinking in the way that children do when they're processing information that doesn't align with the values they've been taught to hold dear. When she spoke again, her voice carried a sadness that made his chest tighten with the realization that his 8-year-old daughter was teaching him something important about justice and proportionality. "Daddy, remember when Mommy used to work with people who did bad things, but she tried to help them learn to be better instead of just punishing them? She used to say that hurting people back doesn't heal the hurt they caused, it just makes more hurt in the world. Do you think Mommy would want us to make 40,000 families lose their jobs because 3 people were mean to us?" The reference to Elena hit Damien like a physical blow, because his late wife had indeed dedicated her career to restorative justice, working with both victims and perpetrators of crimes. to find ways to heal communities rather than simply punish offenders. Elena had believed that true justice required transformation and education, not merely retribution, and she had spent countless hours explaining to Sophia why it was important to respond to wrongdoing with wisdom rather than anger. Sparrow Damien set his voice catching slightly as he realized that his daughter was channeling her mother's values in a way that he had forgotten during his focus on revenge. "What do you think Mommy would want us to do instead?" Sophia's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the kind of moral clarity that children possess before the world teaches them to compromise their principles for practical considerations. "I think she would want us to make sure that what happened to us never happens to another family ever again. But I think she would want us to teach the mean people how to be better, not just hurt them back." The wisdom in her words was undeniable, and Damien found himself remembering conversations with Elena about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the importance of using power to create positive change, rather than simply to punish those who had caused harm. Elena had always believed that true strength came from lifting others up, not from tearing them down, and she had tried to instill those values in both her husband and daughter. "You're right, sweetheart," Damien admitted, feeling something shift in his chest as his daughter's perspective began to change his understanding of the situation. "Mommy would want us to find a way to make things better, not just to make the people who hurt us feel bad. But how do we do that? How do we make sure this doesn't happen to other families without punishing the people who were mean to us?" Sophia's response revealed the depth of her thinking about the problem and the sophistication of her understanding of both human nature and systemic change. "Well, maybe the flight attendant lady and the captain man made a mistake because nobody ever taught them how to treat people who look different from them. And maybe if we help them learn instead of just firing them, they could teach other airplane people how to do better. And maybe we could make rules for all the airplanes so that every family gets treated nicely no matter what they look like or what clothes they wear." As Damien listened to his daughter's proposal, he realized that she was offering him something he hadn't considered: the possibility of transformation rather than destruction, education rather than elimination, healing rather than harm. Sophia wasn't just asking him to spare the airline. She was challenging him to use his power and influence to create lasting change that would prevent other children from experiencing the trauma she had witnessed. "Sophia," he said slowly, his voice filled with pride and amazement at the wisdom his 8-year-old daughter had developed, "I think you might be smarter than your old dad. Would you like to help me figure out how to fix this problem the way Mommy would have wanted us to?" After ending the call with Sophia, Damien sat alone in his London hotel suite, staring out at the city lights while processing the conversation that had fundamentally shifted his perspective on the situation he was facing. The luxury accommodations, the expensive view, the power he wielded over Skyline. Air's fate, none of it mattered as much as the realization that his 8-year-old daughter possessed a moral clarity that he had lost somewhere in the years since Elena's death. Elena Torres had been more than his wife. She had been his moral compass, his conscience, and his guide toward using their family's extraordinary wealth in ways that created positive change rather than simply accumulating more power. As a civil rights attorney specializing in restorative justice, Elena had worked with victims of discrimination, police brutality, and corporate wrongdoing to find solutions that healed communities rather than simply punishing offenders. She had believed that true justice required acknowledging harm, accepting responsibility, and creating changes that prevented future victims rather than simply imposing punishment that satisfied the desire for revenge. Elena had worked with corporations to develop better training programs, with police departments to reform their procedures, and with schools to address bullying and discrimination through education rather than expulsion. In the 3 years since her death in a car accident that still haunted Damien's dreams, he had gradually moved away from Elena's approach to justice and toward a more ruthless business methodology that prioritized winning over healing. The acquisition strategies that had made Titan Capital so successful often involved dismantling companies, eliminating jobs, and extracting maximum value without regard for the human cost of his decisions. But Sophia's questions had forced him to confront the reality that his response to the discrimination on Flight 492 was driven by anger and wounded pride, rather than by the values that Elena had tried to instill in their family. The destruction of Skyline Air would indeed send a message about the consequences of racial profiling, but it would also devastate the lives of 40,000 innocent employees and their families, creating more victims rather than preventing future harm. Damien pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Elena's number, which he had never been able to delete, despite the fact that it would never be answered again. He stared at her name for a long moment, remembering their conversations about the difference between justice and vengeance, about the responsibility that came with power, and about the importance of modeling the values they wanted Sophia to embrace as she grew up. Elena had often said that the true measure of a person's character was how they used their power when they were hurt and angry, when they had the ability to strike back without consequence. She had believed that anyone could be kind when kindness was easy, but that real moral strength came from choosing compassion over revenge, when revenge would be satisfying and justified. The irony wasn't lost on Damien that he was learning this lesson from his 8-year-old daughter, who had inherited Elena's moral courage and clarity of vision. Sophia had watched her father being humiliated and brutalized, had experienced trauma that would affect her for years to come, and yet her first instinct was to consider the impact of their response on other innocent families, rather than to seek maximum punishment for those who had hurt them. He opened his laptop and began researching Skyline Air's workforce, reading about the pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and support staff who would lose their jobs if the airline collapsed under the weight of his financial attack. Many of them were single parents, recent immigrants, people working multiple jobs to support their families, individuals who had no involvement in the discrimination he had experienced but who would pay the price for their executives' failures. Damien thought about Rebecca Hayes, the flight attendant, whose actions had triggered this entire crisis, and realized that he knew nothing about her background, her motivations, or the training she had received that led her to profile him based on his appearance. Elena would have wanted to understand what had shaped Rebecca's biases, what systemic failures had created the conditions for discrimination, and how those root causes could be addressed to prevent future incidents. Captain Thomas Bradley, too, was more than just an arrogant authority figure who had escalated the situation unnecessarily. He was someone who had been shaped by decades of training, corporate culture, and personal experiences that had led him to make a catastrophically wrong decision. Elena would have asked why the airline's procedures had failed, what alternative approaches could have been taken, and how future captains could be better prepared to handle similar situations with wisdom rather than force. The more Damien considered Elena's approach to justice, the more he realized that destroying Skyline Air would be the easy solution, the one that satisfied his anger and demonstrated his power, but ultimately failed to address the underlying issues that had created the conditions for discrimination in the first place. Other airlines would continue to operate with the same biases, the same training failures, and the same systemic problems that had led to his family's trauma. But if he could use his leverage over Skyline Air to force genuine reform, to create new training programs, to establish oversight mechanisms, and to set new industry standards for passenger treatment, then Sophia's trauma could serve a purpose beyond simply punishing those who had caused it. The airline could become a model for change, rather than a cautionary tale about consequences, and other corporations would have a blueprint for transformation, rather than just a warning about the power of social media outrage. Damien realized that his daughter had offered him something far more valuable than revenge, the opportunity to honor Elena's memory by using their family's pain to create positive change that would protect other families from experiencing similar trauma. It wouldn't erase what had happened to them, but it would give Sophia's suffering meaning and purpose beyond simply destroying the people who had caused it. The next morning, Damien placed a call that would surprise everyone involved in the crisis, including Victor Chang, who had been expecting instructions to continue the financial assault that would complete Skyline Air's destruction before the markets opened on Monday. Instead, Damien asked Victor to arrange a direct call with Jonathan Rivers, the airline's CEO, with terms that no one could have anticipated. "Victor, I want you to contact Rivers and tell him I'm prepared to discuss terms for resolving this situation." Damien said, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had characterized all their previous conversations, but with an underlying tone that suggested something fundamental had changed in his approach to the crisis. "Terms for settlement?" Victor asked, clearly confused by the shift in strategy. "Damien, we have them completely destroyed. Their stock is worthless, their credit is frozen, their reputation is in ruins. Why would we negotiate from a position of total strength when we can simply finish them off?" Damien looked out at the London morning, thinking about Sophia's words and Elena's values, and realized that he was about to propose something that would surprise everyone involved in the situation, including himself. "Because destroying them accomplishes nothing beyond satisfying my anger. Victor, I want to try something different. I want to see if we can use this leverage to create actual change instead of just punishment." When Jonathan Rivers received the call from Victor Chang, he was expecting either a demand for an enormous financial settlement or final notice that Skyline Air would be allowed to collapse into bankruptcy without any opportunity for survival. The airline's board of directors had been in crisis meetings for 3 days, exploring desperate options for raising emergency capital or finding a buyer who might salvage some value from the wreckage of their company. Mr. Rivers Victor said, "When the call connected, my client is prepared to discuss terms for resolving this situation, but I need you to understand that what he's proposing is not a traditional settlement. He's not interested in money, and he's not interested in personal apologies. He wants to transform your airline into something that could never again traumatize a family the way yours traumatized his." Rivers felt a mixture of hope and confusion at the unexpected lifeline, but also wariness about what kind of demands might be attached to such an offer. "I'm listening," he said carefully. "What exactly is Mr. Torres proposing?" "Complete transformation of your company's culture, training, and procedures," Victor replied, reading from notes that Damien had prepared during his sleepless night of planning. "Mr. Torres will forgive the debt and allow Skyline Air to survive, but only if you agree to implement a comprehensive program of reforms that addresses the root causes of what happened to his family." The terms that Victor outlined were unlike anything that had ever been demanded in a corporate settlement, because they focused on systemic change rather than financial compensation. Damien wanted mandatory bias training for every employee, from executives to ground crew. He wanted new procedures for passenger complaints that included external oversight and accountability. He wanted transparency in passenger removal decisions with documentation requirements that would make discrimination harder to hide. Most importantly, Damien wanted Rebecca Hayes and Captain Bradley to participate in the solution, rather than simply being fired and forgotten. They would face civil liability for their actions, but they would also have the opportunity to become part of the reform effort, sharing their experiences and helping to develop training programs that would prevent future discrimination. Mr. Torres believes that simply firing your employees and moving on would repeat the same pattern that created this problem in the first place, Victor explained. He wants them to understand the impact of their actions, to take responsibility for the harm they caused, and to use that understanding to help educate others. Rivers was silent for a long moment, processing the unexpected nature of the proposal, and trying to understand why someone with the power to destroy his company would instead offer a path toward redemption. "This is unprecedented," he finally said. "Why would Mr. Torres be willing to forgive a $4.5 billion debt in exchange for training programs and policy changes? Because Mr. Torres has an 8-year-old daughter who taught him that real justice involves preventing future harm, not just punishing past wrongdoing," Victor replied, sharing Sophia's wisdom without revealing the personal details of their conversation. He could destroy your airline and still not prevent another family from experiencing what his family experienced. But if he can transform Skyline Air into an industry leader for passenger rights and dignity, that might actually make a difference for future travelers. The proposal came with strict conditions and oversight requirements that would ensure the reforms were genuine rather than cosmetic. An independent board would monitor Skyline Air's progress with quarterly reports on training effectiveness, passenger complaint resolutions, and cultural change metrics. The reforms would be backed by financial penalties that would automatically trigger if the airline failed to meet specific benchmarks for treating passengers with dignity and respect. Rivers understood that accepting Damien's terms would mean acknowledging that Skyline Air had fundamental problems that went beyond just two employees making bad decisions. It would require admitting that the airline's culture training and procedures had enabled discrimination and needed comprehensive reform. But the alternative was bankruptcy, unemployment for 40,000 people, and the complete destruction of a company that had been serving passengers for decades. "I need to discuss this with my board," Rivers said, "but I want you to know that I'm personally committed to whatever changes are necessary to ensure that what happened to Mr. Torres never happens to any other passenger. If he's willing to give us a chance to transform, rather than just to punish, then we'll prove that his faith in redemption is justified." Damien had given Skyline Air 48 hours to develop a comprehensive reform plan that would address every aspect of the discrimination he had experienced, from employee training to corporate culture to passenger rights protection. The clock was ticking, and the airline's survival depended on their ability to convince him that they were genuinely committed to transformation, rather than just desperate to avoid bankruptcy. The Skyline Air Board meeting that took place that weekend was unlike any corporate crisis session in aviation history, because instead of focusing solely on damage control and financial survival, the executives were forced to confront the deeper cultural and procedural failures that had created the conditions for discrimination in the first place. Jonathan Rivers had assembled not just his senior staff, but also diversity consultants, civil rights attorneys, and former passengers who had experienced similar treatment on various airlines. Rebecca Hayes sat in a conference room at the company's Dallas headquarters, facing a civil rights attorney and a victim advocate who were helping her understand the full impact of her actions on Damien and Sophia Torres. For the first time since the incident, Rebecca was being asked to consider not just the airline's policies and procedures, but the human cost of her assumptions and biases. Rebecca, the victim advocate, said gently, "I want you to watch something, and I want you to really see it through the eyes of an 8-year-old child." She played Sophia's video of the incident, the shaky footage capturing Damien being dragged from the plane while his daughter reached out toward him and called for her daddy. As Rebecca watched the video, seeing her own actions from Sophia's perspective for the first time, something fundamental shifted in her understanding of what had happened that night. She had been thinking of the incident as a policy enforcement issue, a matter of maintaining first-class standards and following procedures. But watching Sophia's terror and hearing her innocent question about whether her father was being hurt because of his skin color, Rebecca realized that she had traumatized a child and destroyed a family's sense of safety and dignity. "I didn't know." Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face as the video ended. "I didn't see him as someone's father. I didn't think about how it would affect his daughter. I just saw a black man in a hoodie, and I made assumptions about who he was and whether he belonged in first class." Captain Thomas Bradley went through a similar process of confronting the reality of his actions, working with a former police officer who had undergone his own transformation after being involved in a controversial arrest that had opened his eyes to the impact of unconscious bias on his decision-making. Bradley was forced to watch body camera footage of other incidents where authority figures had escalated situations unnecessarily, and to consider how his own need to maintain control had prevented him from de-escalating the situation with Damien. "I've been a captain for 15 years, Bradley said during one of his counseling sessions, and I've always prided myself on running a tight ship on not letting passengers challenge my authority. But watching that video, seeing how scared that little girl was, I realized that I was more concerned with winning a power struggle than with treating a paying customer with basic human dignity. The transformation process wasn't easy or quick, and both Rebecca and Bradley struggled with the realization that their actions had been shaped by biases they hadn't recognized, and cultural training that had taught them to see certain passengers as threats rather than as customers deserving respect. But the alternative to this difficult self-examination was unemployment, civil liability, and the knowledge that they had contributed to one of the most shameful incidents in aviation history. Skyline Air's reform plan, submitted to Damien with just hours to spare before his deadline, was comprehensive and unprecedented in its scope and specificity. The airline committed to mandatory bias training for every employee with quarterly refresher sessions and annual assessments. They established a passenger advocate position with the authority to investigate discrimination complaints and override crew decisions that appeared to be based on bias rather than legitimate safety concerns. Most significantly, they created the Torres Family Passenger Rights Charter, a set of policies that guaranteed respectful treatment for all passengers, regardless of appearance, accent, or perceived social status. The charter included specific procedures for handling passenger disputes, requirements for documenting any decision to remove a passenger, and oversight mechanisms that would prevent individual employees from making arbitrary decisions based on personal biases. Damien reviewed the proposal with Sophia, who had insisted on participating in the evaluation process because she wanted to ensure that other children would never experience what she had gone through. Her questions were simple but penetrating. Will they promise to be nice to all families? Will they say sorry when they make mistakes? Will they learn how to treat people better? The airline's commitment to having Rebecca and Bradley become part of the solution, rather than simply being discarded as scapegoats, was particularly important to Sophia, who understood intuitively that people could change and grow if they were given the opportunity to learn from their mistakes, rather than simply being punished for them. 6 months after the incident on Flight 492, the transformation of Skyline Air had become a case study that was being examined by business schools, civil rights organizations, and other corporations seeking to understand how external pressure could be leveraged to create genuine institutional change rather than superficial policy adjustments that failed to address underlying cultural problems. Rebecca Hayes had undergone a complete career transformation, moving from her position as a flight attendant to becoming Skyline Air's Director of Diversity and Inclusion Training, a role that required her to share her story with thousands of airline employees across the industry and help them recognize and address their own unconscious biases before those biases could harm passengers. Her presentations were powerful and personal, focusing not on abstract concepts of discrimination, but on the concrete reality of how her assumptions had traumatized an 8-year-old child and nearly destroyed a major corporation. Rebecca's willingness to accept responsibility for her actions and to dedicate herself to preventing similar incidents had made her an unexpectedly effective advocate for change within the aviation industry. Captain Bradley had also found a new role within Skyline Air's reformed structure, leading the development of conflict de-escalation training for flight crews and teaching other pilots how to distinguish between legitimate safety concerns and personal power struggles that could escalate minor disputes into major crises. His experience with the Torres incident had taught him that true leadership meant protecting all passengers, not just asserting dominance over those who questioned his authority. Tyler Ashford faced a different kind of reckoning as his social media career had been effectively destroyed by his callous celebration of taking Damien's seat and his obvious enjoyment of the incident. However, rather than disappearing completely, Tyler had eventually begun working with anti-bullying organizations to discuss how social media influence could be used responsibly and how online behavior had real-world consequences for the people being filmed and shared. The financial impact of the settlement had been significant but manageable for Skyline Air, which had recovered most of its stock value as investors recognized that Damien's reform demands actually strengthened the airline's long-term prospects by addressing customer service issues that had been growing problems throughout the industry. The company's commitment to transparency and passenger rights had attracted new customers who valued dignity and respect over luxury amenities. Other airlines had voluntarily adopted similar reforms, recognizing that the Torres incident had fundamentally changed customer expectations, and that passengers were no longer willing to accept discriminatory treatment as an unavoidable aspect of air travel. The Torres Charter had become an industry standard, and the Federal Aviation Administration had begun incorporating passenger rights protections into their certification requirements for commercial airlines. The legal proceedings had been resolved through restorative justice conferences that brought Damien and Sophia together with Rebecca Bradley and the security officers who had removed him from the plane. These meetings were facilitated by trained mediators and focused on acknowledgement of harm, acceptance of responsibility, and commitments to preventing future incidents. The conversations were difficult and emotional, particularly when Sophia was able to ask the adults directly why they had treated her father badly and whether they understood how scared she had been when she watched them hurt him. But the process allowed for genuine accountability and healing that traditional litigation could never have provided. Damien had also established the Elena Torres Foundation for Aviation Equality, using a portion of his wealth to fund research into discrimination in transportation support for families who experienced travel-related bias incidents and educational programs that promoted understanding and empathy across racial and cultural differences. The foundation's work extended beyond aviation to address discrimination in all forms of public accommodation. The morning sun streamed through the windows of JFK Airport as Damien and Sophia approached the same gate where their ordeal had begun 6 months earlier, preparing to board another Skyline Air flight to London for Sophia's spring break visit with her grandmother. Sophia held her father's hand tightly, not from fear, but from the comfortable closeness they had maintained since the incident had reminded them both how precious and fragile their family bond truly was. The gate area looked the same, but everything else had changed in ways both visible and profound. The boarding process was more respectful, with crew members trained to greet each passenger with genuine warmth, rather than making assumptions based on appearance or perceived status. The discrimination complaint process had been streamlined and made transparent, with passenger advocates available to address concerns before they escalated into confrontations. As they approached the jet bridge, Sophia noticed a young mother traveling alone with 2 small children, clearly overwhelmed by the boarding process and struggling with carry-on bags while trying to manage her nervous toddlers. Without hesitation, Sophia tugged on her father's hand and pointed toward the family. "Daddy, can we help them?" she asked, already moving toward the mother before waiting for permission. She looked scared like I was that night. Damien watched with pride as his daughter approached the struggling mother and offered to help carry one of the bags, her 8-year-old kindness cutting through the woman's stress and anxiety with the simple offer of assistance. The scene reminded him powerfully of Elena's belief that small acts of compassion could transform difficult situations and create connections across differences. As they boarded the aircraft, Damien was surprised to see Rebecca Hayes standing near the entrance, no longer wearing a flight attendant's uniform, but instead dressed in the professional attire of her new role as Director of Diversity Training. She had requested permission to greet them personally, not as part of any publicity effort, but as a genuine gesture of respect and accountability. "Mr. Torres, Sophia," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying none of the cold authority it had held during their previous encounter. "I wanted to thank you both for giving me the chance to learn and grow instead of simply being punished for my mistakes. What I did to your family was wrong, and I promise you that I'm using that experience to make sure no other child ever has to be scared the way Sophia was scared." Sophia looked up at Rebecca with the direct gaze that children use when assessing adult sincerity, and after a moment of consideration, she smiled with the forgiveness that came naturally to her generous spirit. "Thank you for learning," she said simply. "Mommy used to say that people can always get better if they want to." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it represented everything that Damien and Sophia had hoped to achieve through their approach to justice: genuine accountability, real change, and the possibility of redemption for those who were willing to confront their mistakes and commit to doing better. As their plane taxied toward the runway, Sophia settled into her window seat 1A, the same seat that had triggered the entire crisis, and pulled out a small notebook where she had been writing letters to her mother, sharing the important moments of her life with the parent who could no longer respond, but whose values continued to guide their family's choices. "Dear Mommy," she wrote in her careful 8-year-old handwriting, "today Daddy and I flew on the airplane again, and everyone was nice to us. The lady who was mean before said sorry and promised to teach other people how to be kind. I think you would be proud of us for choosing to help people learn instead of just being angry. I miss you every day, but I know you're happy that we're making the world better like you taught us to." Damien read over his daughter's shoulder and felt a peace that had eluded him since Elena's death, knowing that they had honored her memory by choosing transformation over revenge, healing over harm, and hope over hatred. Sophia had taught him that real power came not from the ability to destroy those who hurt you, but from the wisdom to use that pain to prevent others from experiencing similar suffering. As Flight 492 climbed into the clear morning sky, carrying passengers who would never know how close they had come to being part of aviation history's most expensive mistake, Damien closed his eyes and felt Elena's presence in their daughter's courage in the possibility of change, and in the knowledge that love and justice could coexist when guided by wisdom rather than anger. The Torres family story became a symbol of how wealth and power could be used responsibly to create lasting change rather than temporary satisfaction, and how children's moral clarity could guide adults toward solutions that honored both justice and mercy. Their approach to the discrimination they faced helped transform an entire industry's understanding of passenger rights and human dignity, proving that the most powerful response to hatred was not more hatred but the unwavering commitment to ensuring that no other family would have to endure the same pain. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice transformation and the power of choosing healing over revenge. Share your thoughts in the comments about how you would have handled this situation. Would you have chosen Damien's path of transformation? Or would you have opted for pure punishment? Your perspective matters, and we read every comment. Remember to ring the notification bell so you never miss stories about courage, dignity, and the possibility of change, because together we can build a world where every family is treated with the respect and kindness they deserve, regardless of what they look like or where they come from.